Matthew Moroun, thank you very much for coming in and talking with us today.
Thank you for having me.
First question, before we get into everything else, is there a need for another crossing across the Detroit River?
At the moment, no, and in the foreseeable future, no. The only need for a future crossing is for the Ambassador Bridge to expand its existing bridge for another 83 years of private success, private industry success.
Now, the Canadian government is absolutely convinced there is a need for another bridge. They say that the blue water is maxed, and on any given month, according to the Consul General, the ambassador is at capacity. In a new world of on-time delivery, we need another crossing. Are they wrong?
Well, the Canadian government isn't wrong about how important the border is. The border is very important. What they are wrong about is that right now the Ambassador Bridge is the most efficient operation on both the northern border and southern border for the United States. Trucks and cars, on average, get across the Ambassador Bridge faster than any other border crossing on the border. So, to the extent that they infer that the Ambassador Bridge is antiquated or a slower crossing or people are getting held up on it more than others, they are wrong on that. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The Ambassador Bridge is the quickest crossing across the border.
Now, you say in the future there's also no need for another crossing. That's another place where you disagree.
Well, I didn't quite say that. In the future, there will be a need for another crossing. I'm positive that hopefully that the industrial base will grow back around southern Ontario and in the Midwestern United States. Car production will continue to rebound, and eventually, maybe there will be a need for another crossing. Right now, there's a need to continue the improvements at the Ambassador Bridge, clear through the red tape and allow us to build our private sector bridge without government assistance or taxpayer funds.
Well, I'll get to your bridge in a second, but all this talk right now is about this so-called DRIC, or actually somebody floated the idea of calling it the Gordie Howe Bridge, so they're just not fighting fair, are they?
Well, you know, Gordie Howe fought his own fights. I'm certain he didn't use government assistance.
Let's talk about DRIC. If you believe the way this is being sold on the Canadian side of the river, this is virtually free to Michigan. It's not going to cost Michigan a cent. In fact, it comes with the bonus of allowing Michigan to claim $2 billion in federal matching funds to work on roads in Michigan. So this is better than a free deal. It doesn't cost Michigan a thing. I mean, how in the world can we possibly turn down that deal to get a free bridge?
Well, here's what should happen, Stephen. The Ambassador Bridge is prepared to spend private capital, the same $500 million, to build another span next to the existing Ambassador Bridge. That $500 million of American private sector funds would count just as much towards the federal match as the foreign aid that Canada has offered Michigan. So that $500 million multiplied by 4 would entitle Michigan to $2 billion of federal aid money for the other roads and potholes and bridge repairs that the state has to do. And it would do so without putting Michigan in a situation where they owe something to another country who's giving them a handout. It would also do so in a way that Michigan continues to have a shining light on a private sector success that's done the right thing for the border for 83 years.
Now, the big problem, and this is a really big problem with your plan, is the Canadian government, basically its official position of the Canadian government is your bridge will not land in Canada. How are you going to convince them to change their mind? I mean, they are dead set against it.
That's pretty scary, isn't it? It's not a situation that we relish having, but when a government says to you, you know, we're going to do everything we can to stop the expansion of your private sector business, and we're going to do everything we can to support a government-sponsored bridge to take your private sector business away, despite the fact that when the Ambassador Bridge was born, by acts of Congress and acts of Parliament, there was no such restriction. We don't like it. We're going to do our best to resolve ourselves against that and try to overcome and try to get some wisdom spoken in their ears. But you're right. The Government of Canada sponsors a taxpayer-funded bridge and a government-owned bridge and is against the private sector in this particular instance.
So, I mean, we've even seen you've started a bridge on this side, and it is going, and Canada kind of looks at it as a bridge to nowhere because they're convinced it's not landing in Canada. How are you going to overcome that? That seems to be a major obstacle, and you're talking about expanding your bridge. I mean, it's a fairy tale. It's not going to happen.
Well, of course, legally, Canada's incorrect on that score. The Ambassador Bridge, when it was authorized by Canadian Parliament, was authorized to build, maintain, operate, improve, and expand its business. And building a new span next to the existing bridge is exactly that. So, well, I'm certain that the Canadian government right now has made very clear that they favor a taxpayer-funded bridge 2 miles down the road. I'm also certain that our position is quite clear from a legal standpoint. And we've got 83 years of successful history that says it's the right way to go.
Now, Canada also complains that they've asked you many times over the, I don't know, last 5-6 years to submit an environmental impact plan so they can look at it as the Drick Bridge has done.
Right.
Which I'm quite certain they're going to turn down anyway, because they've also made it clear that the environmental impact of the existing Ambassador Bridge is not satisfactory. They talk about expanding the bridge won't help matters. It'll just put more traffic right into Windsor, which they just don't want. But still,
Right.
Is it true you've just not submitted anything to them?
I also infer that you believe that that's not true.
I'm just saying that's what they're telling me.
So no, of course that's not true. I'd have to wheel in our environmental documents on a cart here to show you, because they're about 5 feet tall and binders with thousands of pages. If their excuse for holding up the expansion of our private sector business is, in fact, in environmental paperwork, I'd love them to make that clear so that we could clean that up and get started on what should have started a few years ago.
You can address their concerns about the traffic going through Windsor then?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I brought with me, Stephen, a picture of just what the bridge looks like and just what the highway number 3, they call it in Canada, looks like on the other side of the bridge. And you can judge for yourself whether or not you think that looks like downtown Windsor or a 6-lane divided highway with concrete medians in the middle, which happens to be one of the biggest roads in Canada.
Let's move on to another subject here also. A lot of people think that a major crossing between two countries, especially in today's world of heightened security, ought to be a venture that is run by governments and not by a private entity. Why should private owners control a major crossing between two countries?
Well, let me tell you about a great story. It was the early 1920s. An American entrepreneur from Detroit named Joseph Bauer ventured out to build the world's longest suspension bridge across the Detroit River. And he made it happen without any government assistance and any taxpayer money. And in 1929, the world's largest suspension bridge in the world opened in Detroit and carried traffic to Windsor, Ontario. That's been a success. It's a shining example of American prosperity. There's more trade that crosses the Ambassador Bridge than any other border crossing in the world. That trade isn't between two governments. That's trade between thousands of private sector businesses in Canada and thousands of private sector businesses in the United States. It's fitting that the bridge that carries that private sector trade also be a model for the private sector and not the government.
In this whole process of discussing Drick, whether there needs to be a second bridge, the expansion of the Ambassador, it seems like you are being painted as the bad guy who wants to hold up progress. Is that your take on the efforts?
What we'd like is to see the red tape go away and to start construction on the second span next to the Ambassador Bridge. Just like the government has in many other locations where the government owns a bridge, they've built a government bridge right next to the existing span. It happened in Port Huron with the second span of the Blue Water. The Canadians are requesting that it happen in Buffalo, New York, to Fort Erie at the Peace Bridge. It's happened in countless other places. The only reason that I've heard of why it shouldn't happen, the only real reason that I've heard of expressed why it shouldn't happen in Detroit is because private sector is bad and government is good. And that's not really a good reason.
Well, the Canadians are pretty convinced their government's pretty good.
Well, I'm sure if you worked for the government, you'd think it was great too.